So welcome to this session on mapping interprofessional education competencies in the curriculum. My name is Margo. I'm from Curtin University over here in Perth on Wujak Noongar lands. I was previously a member of the ANZAHPE board, but am currently chair of the Australasian Interprofessional Practice and Education Network. And I'm just going to hand over to our wonderful Kendall, who is helping manage all of this session, who on behalf of ANZAHPE will do the acknowledgement of country. Thank you, Kendall.
ANZAHPE acknowledges and pays respect to the traditional owners, custodians and knowledge holders of the lands and waters across Australia on which our members live and work, and to their elders past, present and future. ANZAHPE acknowledges Maori as tangata whenua and Te Tiriti o Watangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Thank you very much for that. Very competent welcome, Kendall. As you know, you've signed up to this session where we're going to look at mapping interprofessional capabilities in the curriculum. And our presenters, so I'm starting off presenting today. And then I'm going to be handing over to my colleagues, Professor Tina Brock and Dr. Kim Allison, you can see on screen, from the University of Melbourne, and they're going to give us specific examples. So on the next slide, you'll see the agenda for today. So we're just going to start off giving a bit of an overview of an integrated interprofessional education curriculum that might help you think about where you're heading in terms of getting an interprofessional education curriculum in place, or even if you're on the journey where you might get to. And then I'm going to briefly give an overview of a mapping typology that comes from Health Professional Education and was published in ANZAHPE's journal, the Focus Journal, Focus on Health Professional Education Journal. And then quite a bit of the session, the presentation side of the session, is going to be Tina and Kim giving you a real world example of mapping those interprofessional capabilities in the curriculum at the University of Melbourne. And in about half an hour, we're going to go into the breakout room. So you've got an opportunity to have a really rich group discussion. We've got a prompt question to help facilitate that conversation. And then we'll come back together, share some of the ideas from the group, and then just wrap up the session. So as I said, what I'm going to do is share with you a framework for interprofessional education curriculum integration. I really like this framework. It was published by some of the leaders in interprofessional education back in 2023. So it's relatively new. And as you can see, it's a stepping up curriculum where you might start with quite a fragmented model of interprofessional education. And I've got to say, while fragmented doesn't sound attractive, I think lots of us start there and then we step up through a journey with an aim of trying to get to that interconnected, truly integrated curriculum. So it's quite detailed, the framework. So I'm really just going to present this as a quick overview of a couple of examples of these steps. And as you can see, you've got the reference there, and I highly encourage you to go and read the article in detail. So on the next slide, you can see I've skipped over fragmented because it's not ideal and I don't want to talk about that too much, but I'll just give you a couple of the key points. So the next step on the journey would be to have a connected interprofessional education curriculum. So that's where you're providing opportunities for students to discuss how they would work with other health professionals. There's some focus on the roles and responsibilities, so they've got opportunities to learn about the scope of practice of some other health professions. And the educators, often in this point in the curriculum, they're teaching into other professions, but it tends to be in a uni-professional way. So, for example, I go in and talk to the medical students at my university about interprofessional collaboration, but I'm doing that in a very uni-professional way. The next step we would aim to get to is a more nested, oh, sorry, can you go back one? Sorry, Kim. A more nested curriculum where there's much more opportunities for students to be exposed to and start to develop some interprofessional competencies or capabilities. They've got a lot more opportunities to explore the roles of other professions, how they're similar and different to their own. And the educators are much more collaboratively developing interprofessional education and starting to model teaching the students together. And students gain some early insights into the dynamics of what it means to be in a health or social care team. And they start to work with patients sharing their stories. And they might start to think of patients as team members, which is a critical aspect of interprofessional education. I've skipped over the detail of a webbed curriculum and just will quickly talk about integrated. So this is the ideal of where we're all aiming for, and that includes explicit health systems thinking. And for those who've had the opportunity to read our article that the AIPPEN members published in our ANZAHPE Focus Journal, recently, we talked about this idea of systems thinking being critical to the future of interprofessional education. So in this kind of curriculum, interprofessional competency development is really integrated with uni-professional competencies. So they're not seen as separate, they're truly integrated. There's a team of educators working and teaching together, fully engaged in interprofessional education. And the students get, through this focus on health systems thinking, they understand how to work across contexts in different systems. They truly value and seek out each other's contributions, and they fully see, and patients are fully engaged in the interprofessional curriculum here. So that's just an example. As said, I really encourage you to go and read the paper and think about this, because I think it provides a lovely vision of what the ideal interprofessional curriculum might be, but steps us through realistically how the phases of how we might get there. So that sets a vision for where we might go to. And then next, I just wanted to share with you a curriculum mapping typology. So as I said, this typology is designed specifically for health professional education and was published again in ANZAHPE's journal in 2020. And it has a lot of detail. It's an evidence-based typology developed from a review of the literature. But I just want to share some of a brief overview of the 4 dimensions. So it's got the dimension of, we'll stay on this slide, but it's got 4 dimensions of purpose, product, process, and display. So as you can see here, your thinking and the early stages is, what's the purpose of our curriculum mapping? Do we want to focus on curriculum administration and management? Is it the pedagogy? Is it the teaching? Is it the learning? Or is it about cultural and organisational change? And they're not mutually exclusive. You might decide to focus on all of those or some of those. And this typology, when you get to see all of the detail, really steps you through decisions about how you're going to approach that. So once you've established a purpose, why are you doing the mapping exercise for whom? You can think about the product. So what do we want to map? And I really love this curriculum dimension way of thinking. Do you want to map out what's actually been declared, what's planned or written down? Do you want to map out what's actually taught and delivered to the students? Do you want to map out what's assessed, or do you want to map out some of that lived or hidden, the hidden curriculum, the informal learning? And recently, in preparing an accreditation submission in my own university, we used that to map out the standards for our profession, and it was really helpful. And so you're looking again, what do we want to map? You know, different elements of the curriculum. And then we're thinking about the process. How are we going to map it? Is it going to be a partial look at elements of the curriculum, the whole program? Is it going to be retrospective or prospective? What data sources are we going to use? How are we going to collect and review the data, from whom? And then the dots in these slides represent, there's lots of other detail in this actual typology. And then the last dimension is actually how you're going to end up displaying what you've ascertained from that process. So it talks about the data capture tools, the data input and output methods, and other aspects. So are you going to look, is it going to be a text document, a spreadsheet, a database, some kind of online cloud-based system or mobile app? And one of the prompts you're going to get in for the discussion group is how can we use technology to support this process? Because many of us do this in a very systematic way, but very labor intensive, lots of human resources going through documents. But so we're going to explore, as I said today, about technology. So there's lots of different data outputs that you can have related to the kind of data capture tool that you've got. So again, there's so much detail in that typology as there is in the curriculum framework that it's not a good use of your time for us to just talk at you about that today. So I just wanted to set the scene of highly recommend you use those 2 published pieces of paper. And you'll get links to these references when we give you some follow-up information after today's session. But now I'm going to invite Kim and Tina to talk you through how they actually went about a practical example of curriculum mapping in the Collaborative Practice Centre at the University of Melbourne. So thank you, Tina.
Thanks so much, Margo. Yes, my name is Tina Brock, and I'm the director of the Collaborative Practice Center at the University of Melbourne. And I'm here with Kim Allison, who is a very special person on our team, our senior curriculum coordinator. And she's going to really tell you about the meat of the work that we've done. So next slide. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this work was developed, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders, past, present, emerging. And I'm at the airport, so you may be hearing an announcement, and I'm sorry about that. Just one sec. I was just going to say about that image that it shows some weaving that we did with our students and an Indigenous activity. And I think weaving is a good analogy for what a map can be. So as Margo was saying, it has to do with the materials that you use and the pattern that you follow and really what you want that to look like in the end. And so when I think about bringing Indigenous knowledges into the work that we do, this weaving really spoke to me. Thanks, Kim. So our center is relatively new. We launched in November 2023. So we are essentially 1 year younger than ChatGPT. And I think we would all agree that large language models have gone very fast in our systems. And our work has not gone as quickly as that. And it's partially because we chose to start with an integrated model and with cultural change. So we said, this is going to be really hard. No matter how we do it, let's just go ahead and shoot for the moon. So in background, Margo showed you 2 papers. I'm going to show you the curriculum framework that we followed, which is the one by Thomas and Kern. And I like it because it's a cycle of curriculum development, but it also shows that sometimes we have to cut across and make a little bit of a star. And so the mapping project actually goes in between the general needs assessment phase and the targeted needs assessment phase. And it is coming together with a group of academics that are hosted by the CPC, but their primary appointments are in one of the 6 schools within our educational system. what we did is doing some work that is based on some of the papers coming out of the Health Profession Accreditation Collaborative. We took our original curriculum framework, which was based on the Canadian framework, and was beautiful, but quite complicated. And since we were at the beginning of the journey, we did a lot of workshopping and socialization across our schools to come up with what's called the Ways of Knowing, Learning, and Leading Together for Collaborative, Person-Centered Care. That's a long title for anyone to remember. And so what we call it is the WAYS curriculum. And so Kim's going to talk a little bit about the ways we found we are learning about, from, and with each other, one another, ways that we can integrate this and use this to drive culture change in our programs. So Kim, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Tina. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from home today on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. But I'd also like to just, I think this session has been set up really nicely about the process and then how we have gone about this process. But I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm presenting, you can see on the screen here, this is the group of people who did this work, and they're a fantastic team. And the concept for this work predated our recruitment and was developed by other people in the centre. So Tina, Jo Bolton and Liz Malloy. So we've heard a little bit about the purpose of the why of the mapping project, and I'll cover the what and the how and the process and the display under those categories. But just to start with the people or the who, and so you can see the team here, and these academics were intentionally recruited across our faculty, and they represented the disciplines which sit in our faculty, which you can see on the right. So as Tina's alluded to, the mapping project was essentially to identify curriculum across the faculty that aligned with the collaborative practice curriculum or the WAYS curriculum, with the primary objective for us to be able to upregulate collaborative practice curriculum and IPE. But because of the nature of interrogating curriculum, there's probably some very real and important cultural considerations about how to go about this. And as we were mapping for collaborative curriculum, the ethos of the process needed to equally be collaborative. And so staff were recruited who were authentically living the curriculum within their home disciplines. And obviously for logistical reasons, this meant that the mapping was as accurate as possible because these staff would have better access to curriculum, the LMS and staff. But the other was obviously for the cultural objective that we had to make sure that this was a collaborative and non-threatening look at the existing curriculum. And by recruiting us or members of our team, we all sort of inadvertently became sort of IPE advocates within our own disciplines. So there's that sort of second outcome from that. So that's the who. And what we were looking for. So fundamentally, we were looking for curriculum across all the programs that mapped to the 12 learning outcomes of the WAYS curriculum that was briefly presented on an earlier slide, and I'll touch on again. And this was to identify gaps and opportunities for collaborative practice curriculum, and it was interrogated by looking through the electronic handbooks, so looking for subject and course intended learning outcomes first, and then this was done manually by the subject coordinators, and then we wanted to derive exactly what was being delivered, so not just the planned curriculum, and so we were looking for the learning activities and the assessments that were underway, as well as identifying other IPE initiatives, because obviously within this faculty we have fantastic academics that have sort of been developing their own IPE through their portfolio. So we wanted to pick up on what was being done. And you heard that the CPC is relatively young, sort of only a few years old, but in that time they've developed some great curriculum that was available to the faculty. So we wanted to capture where that had been picked up, and as well as obviously looking for opportunities for where we could embed this curriculum or future curriculum. And so this was our overarching aim or our purpose, I guess. And we did this sort of through 2 phases. And so phase 1 was essentially just a process of content analysis. We had access to all the publicly available handbooks for the subjects across the faculty, and we mapped the course intended learning outcomes and the subject intended learning outcomes, as well as the generic skills. And this was a very, I guess, a process-driven approach, and it cast a really wide net. So you'll see on the bottom of the screen here the 12 learning outcomes that were represented for the WAYS curriculum, and I've bolded the key terms that we were fishing for, essentially. And so you can imagine that picked up a lot, which was great, because then that identified many subjects that we might want to have a discussion about. You can imagine that the term communication comes up in most health or social sciences in those subjects, but whether that was interprofessional communication, the next step was to speak to the subject coordinators. So this was a very wide first pass, I guess, which was good. And then we stepped on to the stakeholder engagement, which essentially was field interviews with individual subject coordinators. And we had a standardized interview guide, which was customized to what concepts we'd identified in phase 1. And then we spoke to the subject coordinators with those objectives. So to validate the data interpretation that we'd done from the handbook analysis, and then to drill down into those learning activities and assessments. And then we sort of interviewed, I guess the interview became broader, and we were seeking to understand the scope and the strengths of the subject from the perspective of the subject coordinator, so that they could tell us about any existing IPE activities and understand their perspective about how things would authentically fit in their program. So how we may integrate some of those WAYS curriculum and any future IPE opportunities, really, that were based on, I guess, organically. You can imagine it became very clear where there were synergies between disciplines that might work, as well as logistical synergies about timetabling and things like that. So as a teaching academic, you can imagine this process was a real privilege to get insight to what was going on across the school. And I'm sorry, I should have mentioned I'm from physiotherapy. So I was representing the School of Health Sciences, and I was mapping 3 courses within the School of Health Sciences. And so it was easy for me, I guess, to make iterative sense of those 3 subjects as we went. But that sort of was, I guess, I'll speak to it later, but that is also a little bit of a challenge. But we've been reflecting about this curriculum mapping the other day, and that the mapping is obviously a verb and not a noun. And so we were thinking about that the process itself had more value than the output potentially. Is the output is just a data set as like one point at time, and that would constantly evolve. So and we can update that absolutely through the process, but the crowdsourcing element of this project, I think, gave the most value, that people felt part of the journey, were able to contribute, and now we are able to sort of privilege the great ideas that they have and connect them with other people. So that's what we did, and I'm mindful of time, so I thought I'd briefly anchor this context within the framework Margo had provided, just so that makes sense. And as Margo alluded to, in terms of the purpose, it can be multidimensional, and it certainly was multidimensional for us. We have a large data set that will be used for different things for different people. The what, again, we went with the wide path. So we were looking at what was being taught as well as what was planned. And some subjects were in the process of like course redesign. So we were opportunistically getting in at that angle. So again, you can see that we cast a really wide net, which makes sense because there was a lot of effort and manpower in this project. So we were very lucky to be able to sort of go ahead and get as much as we could. And so I've spoken to how we collected this data. It was a 2-phase component, and the idea is that this will be a living data set. But obviously the outcome is that there is a clear map for us in the Collaborative Practice Centre, because this is a needs analysis to guide our further curriculum development and integration. But like I mentioned, there are a number of stakeholders. So the way we display this data sort of depends on I guess the individual stakeholder we're communicating with. So I'll give you an example of our data display. So it was a very manual process, which has some strengths and some weaknesses, but certainly I think the human factor was really strong in this process. So this, the data collection was conducted in the last 6 months of last year, and then at the start of this year, it's been sort of the sense making or the data analysis, which is much more complicated than just collecting data. So I'm just going to present some of the ways of data display. So this is probably, with my research brain, this is the easiest and most consumable, but probably the least useful sort of way of presenting data. You can see on the left the WAYS outcomes that were related to relational reflexivity, which I've mapped to the course intended learning outcomes of the physio program, and then the subjects that had subject intended learning outcomes that mapped to those learning outcomes. The columns H and I indicate whether it was these things were picked up in the handbook and whether they were validated by interview. And you can see by the time you get to the interviews phase, that knocks out some of the people you captured in the wide path. And then this is a table from a report to our head of school, of obviously who will have value about understanding what's being done in the program for accreditation purposes. So I've given some exemplar curriculum on the right. For our purposes, I guess looking at developing that map of where IPE might go, this is the structure of the physiotherapy program again, just because it's my home discipline. And we're just using a traffic light system for whether there are current opportunities for IPE, so sort of green, things already happening, orange potential, and red, they're probably lower hanging fruit that makes less sense to do. And you can see for the physio program, obviously that's very science or manual based subjects like pharmacology, or teaching a student manips or something doesn't necessarily lend the most richest environment for IPE, that we can get better bang for buck in the other subjects. And the final map that we've got here is, you can see just where subjects have been identified for existing WAYS modules and where we can pop them in. I should have acknowledged actually the little icons that we're using throughout was the genius child of Tina Brock, but with her WAYS curriculum. You can see that this is the WAYS logo, because the idea is that this curriculum obviously is crowdsourced, that people are contributing and we're picking things up along the way and able to identify them that way. And so then we thought we'd finish with the lessons learned, so the warts and all, because obviously on paper all research projects look very polished and smooth. But I guess of course, there were a few things that we learned from the process. Like I mentioned, the recruitment process and the development of the team was probably I guess, the jewel in the crown of this project almost, because of the cultural impact and the ripple effect that has had. However, there were some logistical things, because we were all seconded just 1 or 2 days. We didn't necessarily overlap a lot. And so there was a bit of a lost opportunity to sort of co-design and integrate our ideas along the way. So that was probably an opportunity that we missed. And as we are all human beings, we all went into the field interviews in a slightly different way. So taking our own professional lens to the interpretation of the handbooks and the interviews. And while that was could be viewed as a strength of the work, because we were reporting back to our own disciplines in most cases, we were using their language, which was helpful. But it was also at odds a little bit of the collaborative practice principles of having a shared language, or looking at it in the broader or more integrated sense. But I guess my major takeaway from this was probably what I already knew. The automated or the real strict research methodological parts, like mapping course intended learning outcomes, subject intended outcomes, very easy. But I guess the higher order skills of being able to engage in conversations with people that you may or might not know if you were interviewing outside of your own discipline was obviously the most important thing. And through the process, it was clearly evident, which I think is a really good thing for our centre, was that all the teaching staff in our faculty are obviously brilliant. They're sort of doing great things already, like I guess the fragmented term, which you're right, has a negative connotation, but not necessarily is negative. People are doing heaps of brilliant things, and obviously, like all teaching academics, above and beyond their standard hours and things like that. And so the ability that we will be able to shine a light on that, I think is really great for our staff. So I notice I'm right bang on 1:30, which is great because thanks, Tina, because obviously the intention of these sessions is to allow people to move into breakout rooms and learn from and with and about each other. So we have, I think, 20 minutes for that. Am I right, Kendall? Yeah, I'm getting a nod. And Kendall will tell you the logistics about how to do this with a large number. But what we are considering as might be a helpful prompt. We've talked about a process that was very manual, so very human driven. And at the same time we were doing this, colleagues in biomedicine wrote a digital algorithm to map right across their program. And so that was probably at the other end of the spectrum and had some distinct advantages. So we're sort of posing the provocative question, what is the role of our new teammate, AI or ChatGPT or whatever code we write within curriculum mapping? And so Kendall will put in the chat a URL for a Padlet, and because limitations of time, it would be amazing if there is one person within the breakout group who's happy to guide the discussion and perhaps another who's happy to document the team's responses on Padlet. You can access it through the QR code here, or Kendall will put that in the chat. Kendall, I think you'll be able to provide much better instruction than me, but that's our setup.
That was great, Kim. I'm going to open all the rooms and please designate a facilitator just to help you through it. The Padlet link is in the chat if you need it, and I will see you all in 20 minutes.
There was a rich discussion in my group with, thinking about AI as a virtual assistant, helping with some of that grunt work, but then concerns, about confidentiality and who owns our curriculum and our documents and things like that. Was there anything else, Tina, that you noticed in the chat or in your group that we might share as a final sort of summary? There's
some good stuff in there. Look, our conversation was really rich, and even though we represented many different universities, many different professions, and sort of different stages of this process, I think there felt to me a real push to do this cohesively and to share widely and to really support and energize this process in new and different ways. On the AI side, I influenced my group a little bit about, let's let the machines do what the machines do best, and let's let humans do what humans do best, which is that focus on relationships and the relationships it takes to energize cultural change. Please correct me, team, if I said anything incorrect there.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. It's certainly no replacement. Well, I don't see it as a replacement, a useful tool. But I think that when you were describing your curriculum mapping process at the University of Melbourne, it sounded very relational, and if you could move away, I think, from doing all that grunt work, and we could put our handbooks and others in, and it could, even if we had to use a closed systems, so what we manage the confidentiality, but then we could focus our energies on the relationships and drawing out of people what's working, what isn't working, how, why, what could we do differently. I think there would be some real wins because we're all time poor. But as you said, that's what humans do well, that relational part of the process. Anything, Kim, from what you were noting in your group or looking at what was in the Padlet comments, which we will share with everybody so you can see that. We'll share that later.
No, I think you two ladies articulated it very similar to what was being discussed in our group, and anybody else correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess it was having AI as an ally, and the nuance of the reality is it's the human factor that makes sure that we don't make errors and we're all speaking the same language, but importantly that that the people come along. So very similar.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing that came up was checking the accuracy of what we're getting, which is always something we have to do. Even when it's humans, I have to check check my work for accuracy. So, you know, yes, absolutely. And so I guess, yeah, I hope you've got, I've added to the chat the reference to the 2 articles, the framework and mapping I talked about earlier. And Tina and Kim, the reference you had for Thomas Kern, and that's actually a whole book, isn't it? A curriculum document. So if you get a chance, you might add that into the chat. But in terms of, we hope that you've heard some information today and got some resources to help you on the journey wherever you're at in mapping interprofessional education. You know, thank you all very much for your interest in the topic. But I'd like to acknowledge that ANZAHPE has got some amazing upcoming events. So we've got on the 17th of April, in the How Do I series. So this relates to the interprofessional supervision. So how do you reach beyond your profession to build partnerships for interprofessional supervision? And also the masterclass on the 15th of May. These are amazing. How do I support staff and students to engage with AI? You see both of those are very linked to what we talked about today. We also have a series of networking events that Let's Talk About. And we've got a date there, the 19th of June. So put the date in your calendar, but we're just waiting for finalisation of the presenters and what the topic will be for that. Most importantly, one of the best opportunities for health professional educators is the annual ANZAHPE conference, which is here in Perth from the 30th of June to the 3rd of July this year. And if you haven't been before, I highly encourage you to consider coming to the conference. Interprofessional education is a very strong theme, and you get opportunities to learn and catch up with lots of different people. And I know that certainly Tina and myself will be there, and you can come and find us. You'll see Kendall at the ANZAHPE booth and others. Kim, are you coming along? Yes, Kim will be there as well. So you can try and find us and catch up and share some thoughts about that. But it's a wonderful conference. It's my favourite event of the year. But also we've talked about a couple of papers that have been published in our ANZAHPE's journal, FOPE, we call it, Focus on Health Professional Education, as it says in the title. It's a multi-professional journal, so you get to read papers that are interprofessional, but also from lots of different disciplines, and it's now, got a Q2 rating. It's got an impact factor, so very excited. And there's some great papers in there, including some that we've talked about today. So I encourage you to have a look at that. The other thing is, like everybody, we're always looking for feedback about today's event, how we can make these webinars better. That hour for a webinar always flies by, but we encourage you to take a moment to provide some feedback. You can see the survey link there, and you will get an email following this, which will give you access to the video recording, to the survey. We'll share with you the Padlet and things like that, so that you've actually got some practical resources to go away with. Anything else, Kendall, that you wanted to add in relation to that?
That is perfect, Margo. You've wrapped it up beautifully. Thank you, Kim and Tina, very much for presenting today. You've done a wonderful job.
Yeah, great. Well, and thanks everybody. I hope you've got some thoughts and some practical tips to go away with. I hope to see many of you either in another online ANZAHPE event or at the conference live and in person. So enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. All the best.